Hello everyone, welcome back to lecture 18, and in today's video we are diving into how you can build your very own user interface in Highrise Studio using UXML for structure, USS for styling, and Lua for interactivity. This guide is perfect for anyone looking to enhance their game's UI, whether you are a beginner or an experienced developer. We will explain everything about UI. This might be split into different sections or even different or multiple episodes, but I will try my best to explain how the UI works on my end. How do I think of the UI when I'm building it? I've seen a lot of you having issues and I've seen a lot of requests about this. So let's get started explaining what is UXML. UXML, or Unity Extensible Markup Language, is a markup language similar to HTML or XML, but designed specifically for Unity. It allows you to define the structure of your UI in a clear and organized manner. Let's start creating a basic UXML layout and then move into styling and adding functionality. Now, to first create a UI, you will have to go to your project panel in the assets, and I already have a folder called scripts. So I'm going to right click and create a new folder, and I'm going to call this folder a UI. Now I don't have anything prepared for this video, so I will be building whatever UI comes in mind. For example, let's build something called a shop. So in the UI, I'm going to right click, create, and another folder, and this folder will be called shop. Now, I'd like to keep things organized, so I like to create each UI in a different folder, because with every UI comes three files: the Lua file, the UXML file, and the CSS file, or the USS, sorry. In the shop, I'm going to right click, create, Lua, and then I'm going to select UI. And here, this is very important. I always like to keep my UI names lowercase, because if you write it in a uppercase, it will split the name into different letters in the USS. I will explain this later, but for now, just use lowercase. So I'm gonna call this shop UI. As you can see here, we created the UI and it created three files: a Lua file, USS file, and a UXML file. Now to open it, just double click on the shop UI, for example, and here you are. So again, we have three files. Now let's head to the shop UI.uxml file. And in here, you can see the structure. We have the XML version and then the UXML, which defines the namespace for the editor, it's Highrise UI. And then we have the UI Lua view, which work as the container of the entire UI. So everything we put in here will be related to the shop UI. Let's explain a few things about elements. Now, this is called an element. This is called an attribute. Now, you might be wondering what is an element and what's an attribute. Now let's head to the documentation here. In the documentation, I have a user interface tab you can find under create, and there's the UXML tab, and there's an overview. Now here I explain everything about UXML, and then there's elements, attributes, nesting, structure, and then UI tool debugger. Now this is in order. You have to start by the overview and then go to elements and then attributes. So let's go to elements. Now, elements are building blocks of user interface in Unity. Each element represents a specific UI component, and they can be nested to create complex interfaces. Elements can be either self-closing or containing other elements. For example, in here we have a visual element and it's opened and we close it here. To close the element, you always have to put this slash, and then all the other elements goes in here. Now the elements that goes inside will be related to this element. Again, here we have an example. So for example, here we have visual element that has a class button, and inside the button we have an icon, which is another element called an image. So this is all in one element. So now it's a nested element. Here we have a bunch of examples for scroll UI view and buttons and etc. Now the attributes are basically UXML elements can have various attributes that defines their properties and behavior. Here are some of the important ones. So first we have a name. If you want to call this visual element in Lua, you will have to add a unique name to the element. We have a class attribute, which is one of the most important one. It will define the class or the style for that specific element. So for example, in here we have a container highlighted for that visual element. This will let us access the visual element using the container class when we are adding USS. And then the speaking mode, which is basically stuff that we will explain later. That's for the elements. Let's go to the attributes. Now in the attributes, basically we just explained it, but attributes are used to define the properties of a UXML element. They are key value pairs that are used to set the appearance, behavior, and other properties of elements. We have a bunch of them here if you want to go over them, but we will focus on the class and the name. Nesting is what we talked about earlier in our elements. So here's a good example for nesting. We have a visual element called profile card, and we close it right here. Inside the profile card, we have a profile header, and inside the profile header, we have a username. Now, in the profile body, we have another element, and we have two elements inside of it, image and label. Now, I know that this might be confusing, and for that, I'm going to be opening the Paint, the old classic Paint. Now, like I said, I haven't prepared anything, so I'm just going to show you how I see this. Now, you're probably looking at this and wondering, like, what the hell is this? You can't see visual changes in front of you unless you enter the play mode or unless you start adding styles. But I'm going to explain this really quick to just help you understand what this is about. So basically, the first element is the profile card. I've never used this actually before. Let me just, okay, there you go. That's good. So first element is the profile card. So let's say this is your profile card, right? Now in the profile card, we have a profile header, which is another element inside the profile card. So let's say this is the profile header. Now inside the profile header, we have another element, which is called username. That username will be right here. Now under the profile header, we have profile body, which is this area right here. Let's change the color. How do you change? Okay, so this is the profile header, right? So this is the profile header. Okay. And then just say green for the profile body. So this is the profile body goes in here. And in the profile body, we have image and we have a label. So the image is a profile picture, which goes like this. And then there is the player status, which is the label that goes right here. Does that make sense? So right now, if we look into this, we have a profile card. And in the profile card, we have a profile header. And in the profile header, we have a username that's in the pink. And then in the profile body, we have a profile picture, it's green. And then there is the player status, which is under the profile image. Does that make sense now? This is how it works. Look at here, we have a bad example on how over-nested structure look like. We have visual element inside a visual element, inside a visual element, and inside a visual element, which is overcomplicated. We don't need it. It's bad, okay? Here we explain using flex directions. For example, if we are building a UI and we apply the flex direction in the USS, which I will explain later about in a detailed video, but let me just really quick show you what it looks like. So this is the flex direction. If it's set to column, you can see this order in a column. If it's set to row, then the order will be in a horizontal view. That's all you need to know for now. So let's head back to Unity and start creating what we just learned. So if we come here and we open the shop UI again, now in the UXML file, let's create a similar UI to what we were just creating. I'm not going to even look at the code that we had. So I'm going to look at this image. If let's say we want to create the same image as this one, how to do it? First, we need the profile card, which is the shop UI in this example, but instead I will create a container inside of it. So let's go ahead and say visual element class. I'm going to give this a container class and I'm going to close it using this element. That's how you close an element. You can either close it like this or you can close it like this. Okay. But if you want to have elements inside of it, now ignore the autocompletion. I'm using Copilot, but for now, we're just going to call this container. Now inside this container, we will include everything else like the header, and then there's the body. So let's include a header inside the container. So in this example, we're going to say, even Copilot understands it. So let's say header, okay? And we're going to close the header. Now inside the header, we want to have a title. So let's create another element and call this a label class title. Now the title here, we learned about attributes earlier. It takes another attribute and it's called text. Now whatever text we write in here will be displayed in the header. Now the reason why we close this is because the header or the title does not have any nested elements inside of it. So right now we have a container that has a header and we have a title that's inside the header. And to make things clear, let's just separate those just like that. So right now, if we do like a comment, so I have a header, and then in here, I'm just gonna say root element, which is the container. Okay, does that make sense? So now inside the container, we want to include a body. So let's just go ahead and create another visual element and call this a body. And inside of it, we will be adding like profile image or label or anything. So let's go ahead and create a new element called image. We're going to give it a class. I'm going to say, we don't have to say background. Let's just say, for example, product. Okay, so product image. Now, don't always follow Copilot if you're using it because the source is a wrong attribute. We don't use it. It's basically using what HTML uses. So I'm going to close this. That's all I need is an image with a class. And then under the image, we are going to include like a label and we're going to say product name. And let's just give this a placeholder called product name. Now, that's done. Now we have a complete, let's just write a comment here and say, this is the body, okay? So that's exactly what we just created. It's what we have in this image right here. It's that simple. We just need to add styling, but first, before we add styling, we have to add this to the game. So let's go to Unity, and in here, we're gonna create a new project in the hierarchy, a new object. It's an empty object, and I'm gonna call this shop UI. Now here you can have lowercase, uppercase, it really doesn't matter. Now I'm going to drag the shop UI and I'm going to put it in the inspector for the shop UI object. Now for the output, we have three different outputs: world, above chat, and HUD. Now the world will act as a mesh. If I select world, you can see here it creates a mesh, and you can see here's a plane. Now the UI will be displayed in here, but that's not what we want. So I'm going to remove the components and I'm going to change this from world to above chat. Now, above chat is when we open the chat, it will just push the UI above the chat, as it will always be above the chat. And then there is HUD. If we select the HUD, it will display the UI on the screen and the chat will not affect it. And in most cases, we will be using a HUD. We only use above chat when we have like buttons that we want to make it responsive with the chat. Does that make sense? Next step is the game. When I'm building UI, I like to always have the game on the right side right here. And I don't want the game view because we will be building a mobile first UI because more than 70% of our users play Highrise on mobiles. So I'm going to select the simulator right here. And in here, I don't want this iPad view. Instead, I want a different screen size to work with. My current phone is iPhone 16, and I also have another one which is 13. So I will be using either 16 or 13 just to simulate the what the UI will look like on my phone. So in here, you can open this and you can search for the phone that you have. There's no 16, so I'm going to go with the 13 Pro Max. And if you don't have these options, you might have a button called Install Additional Devices. Click on it and then select the device you want to work with. That's done. I can start or enter the play mode. Perfect. You can see here, shop, product name. That's all we get. Now, everything will now rely on styling. So let's start adding some styling to this. Okay, so here's our shop UI. I'm going to put this right here and I'm going to start building because every time we save, it will be applied on in Unity. We can see the changes. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag the shop USS and put it in here just to see the names of the elements that we have. So we have shop UI, container, header. So let's just add everything in here. To access each class, you have to put a dot and then the class name. So for example, dot container and open the brackets, dot header, open the brackets, and dot body, open the brackets. Now, there's a lot to learn about USS. If you're not familiar with the USS, I recommend you visit this page. So let me just find it for you. So it's called USS Properties. So if you search on Google USS Properties and you find USS Properties, you can find all the properties for the classes that you need. For example, background color, background image, width, height, margin left. There's a lot to learn here, but I also explained all of them, or not all of them, pretty much the most important ones in the USS documentation. If you go here to the classes, we explained what the classes are. We explained how to set image width, height, or use images, how to set up buttons, and how to create stuff like that. Okay, so make sure to check this out. But for now, we're just going to use basic stuff. So let's go back to Unity and start building or styling our UI. Let's start with something basic. First, the shop UI. We want the shop UI to take the full width and height of the screen. So let's just say width 100% and then height 100%. Let's save and click in here. Nothing changed because we still haven't touched anything inside of it. But you can see I can't move around the camera now, and that's because there's a UI here. And to make this visible, let's just add a background to it. So let's say background color, just an example, let's set red. You can see now that we have a full UI. Does that make sense? Now let's select the UI again, and just to make things easier, I will try to do something like this. So double click on the simulator and then put these tabs next to each other just to see how we are working with the UI. Now that's great, but we don't want the UI to take the entire screen. How do we fix this? To fix this, we're gonna go with something called position absolute. Now this will let us move the UI however we want. So for example, if we do top and then like 50 pixel, it will just move the UI 50 pixels from the top. If we do, for example, bottom 50 pixel, it will move it from the bottom. And if you do like right left, so let's say for example right, it will just move it to the right. Okay, perfect. So let's remove this and let's add for example, let's add a different background color. So in this case, let's just go with something like a black color, maybe 141317. It doesn't really matter, whatever you want. Okay, perfect. Assuming that you want a max width and max height because you don't want the UI to take the entire screen. How do we fix this? We do have a width 100% and a height 100%, but we can set property to make it set a specific width that it can't exceed that limit. So let's say max width, for example, and then let's say max height. And in here, we want to have something like, for example, 300 pixels, and for the height, something like 100 pixel. You can see now that it limits. Look, I can still move the around, the camera around, because it's all limited inside or in between the 300 pixel and 100%. So for example, let's say you want this to be max height of 500 pixel and then max width of 300 pixel, right? I think it makes sense for now because I'm understanding myself. You should also understand me. This is the UI that we have, but I don't like the position. We can go ahead and say right 50 pixel, maybe top 100 pixel, and just move it around to just try to center it, but it's not centered. You can see here there's a space, there's a little space, and it's not centered. What we can do is we can say align self center, and this will put it in the center. Does that make sense? Perfect. Now we can push this a little bit from the top, for example, 20 pixel from the top, or you can just let's do something like 50 pixel for now. Perfect. I like this position, but I don't like the width. Let's make the width a little bit longer. So let's say something like 350 pixels. Okay. Now you can see the borders here are ugly. Let's make them rounded. So let's do something like border radius, and let's go with something like 10 pixels. You can see now that the border radius are rounded, or the borders are rounded. We can even do something like 50 pixels. Look at that. You can do whatever you want in here. So let's go with something like 15 pixels. That's perfect. Now, we have something called container. The container will be inside the shop UI. Let me show you. If I do background color and I do red, you can see here that this is the container. And the container should be basically containing all the objects or the elements that we have. So it should take the entire width and height. But if you've noticed, we have a small issue here. The container is overlapping the main UI. You can see that we did set a border radius to make it rounded, but on top it's not. And that's because there's something called overflow. The entire UI is called shop UI, and the container inside the UI is taking over the shop UI. To fix this, you go to the shop UI and you just type overflow and you hide it. Hidden. There you go. You can see now that it's not taking or overlapping the main UI. Now let's work on the container. Now first things first, you can see here that the product name and the shop are basically too close to the edge of or to the sides of the main UI. How do we fix this? There's something called padding. If we put a padding, we have padding left, padding right, top, and then bottom. So for example, let me just show you. If I do padding top 50 pixels, you can see here that now we have space, empty space here. And nothing can go in here because that's called padding. If you do padding left, for example, 5 pixels to push the content from the left a little bit so it's not too close to the edge, it's going to push them a little bit. If we do padding right 5 pixels, it will also push them, but you can't see because we don't have content in here. And then of course there's padding bottom, and we do 50 pixel again, you're going to see that it's going to push them up. Perfect. But we don't want to keep saying padding, padding, and then top, left, right, bottom. Instead, we want to have something like padding 5 pixel. This will apply the padding to left, bottom, right, and top. So if we save, you can see now that this is reasonable. We have a space under, we have a space above, we have space on the left, and there will be space on the right. Okay, great. Now, I don't like how the container is fixed at the top, because basically a container means that it will contain all the content inside the shop UI. So how do we fix this? We fix this by putting a width of 100% and a height of 100%. Now the container is taking the entire UI. So everything we build inside the container will be just as the same value as the shop UI. Okay? So now let's start by modifying the shop and the product name. Remember, we have something called header. The header is also another element. So let's take a look at the header. So let's say background color green. You can see that this is the header now. Now, the header has an issue here. And that issue is that the padding is affecting it, right? But if we set the width to 100%, it doesn't do anything. And why is that? That's because everything inside the container will have a padding on the left and on the right. So if we put a header or if we put a body, it will apply that padding, which is wrong. So what we do now is we take that padding from the container. So we remove this and we put it inside the header. So padding 5 pixel. Now you can see that the header now has the full width, but the padding still applies to what's inside the header. Does that make sense? Perfect. Now for the header, I don't like how it's tiny. Let's extend its height a bit. So let's say height and do something like 50 pixels. That's better. Now the elements inside the header, which is the shop, is a little bit ugly. Who wants a header that has text on the left? I want the text to be centered. How do we center it? There's a lot of methods. First, we can align items, center. This will make all the items inside the header in the center, but it's still not in the middle. You can see that there's still space here. How do we fix that? Justify content center. Oh, did I just try? Yeah, justify. There you go. It's centered. Awesome. There's one more step. Unity, text, align, middle, center. So now everything we put in the header will be in the center. Does that make sense? Great. Now let's add a color for the text. How to add a color for the text is very simple. Color and just do white. There you go. Let's adjust the size of the text. Let's go ahead and say size or font size. Sorry, font size. Let's do 20 pixels. Perfect. I don't like the font. Let's change the font. So Unity, font, definition. I'll explain a bit about this later. Let's just go with something like font black. Now you can see that changed. I'm not going to explain too much about the classes. I'm just going to show you how I build them because there's a full list of USS properties that you can go over in the Unity documentation. So please go ahead and check that out. This is great. Now that we are done with the header, let's move to the body. Now you see here that we didn't touch the title, and that's because the title relies on the header, and the header has only one element inside of it, which is the title. In this case, we don't really need to touch the title unless we want to make the title wrap the text. So it's, instead of going all like behind the UI, we just want to have like 2 lines. We can then touch the title, but in this case, I'm not gonna do anything with the title. Let's work on the body. Now, the body should have the full width and the full height. So let's go ahead and say width 100%. Awesome. Remember how we set a padding to the header? We should do the same for the body. So let's go ahead and say padding 5 pixels. You can see now it moved down. Again, let's go ahead and say Unity font definition. We're gonna go with something regular, and then the color is white for the font, and let's say the font size is 20 pixels. There you go. Perfect. Now we want to align everything in the middle. There's something here that you might have noticed. Why do we have a product name but we don't have an image? We don't have an image because we didn't actually set one. But the image is an element. So if we set a width or a height to the image, it should show the image, but it should show like the dimensions of the image, but it will not show the image. Let's try. We can access the image in 2 different ways. We can either do product image, just like we do it, and say width, for example, 100 pixels, height 100 pixels. You can see here that it moved down, and that's because there's an actual image here, but we didn't assign any image. Let's add a background color and say yellow and see if it shows. Perfect, it's showing perfect. So we want to make this image rounded. How do we make it rounded? Let's go ahead and say border radius 50%. Border radius, sorry, that's a typo. Border radius. We got an image with a circle dimension. Okay, perfect. Now, remember when we had this issue with the overflow before? If I remove the overflow, you can see here that because we are taking the full width of the header and the full width of the container, it override the border radius that we set earlier. It will do the same exact thing for the image. And for that, I recommend you always use overflow hidden for images. So overflow hidden for the images, because we have a circle image and we want that image to be inside of it, right? Perfect. So now to use the images in Unity, what we can do is we can call the Unity image. Okay. To get it, you can have a URL, you can have basically there are a bunch of different ways to import images. I don't want to really go over how to import images right now, so I'm just going to show you a quick example in here. Let me find it in the documentation, and you can go over it later. So if I find this one here, okay, in here, classes, custom icons. So you go to custom icons, and you can see here I have steps on how to import your icons, and this applies to the images as well because icons are images. And you can see here that we have a URL with the icon and the icon settings and a bunch of different ways to import them. So please go ahead and take a look at this and try to import your own. But for this example right here, I'm just going to include a built-in icon. Okay, so for the Unity images, I'm gonna say var image icon more, just for the sake of the tutorial. You can see here that we have this icon, right? So now we want to put everything that we have right here in the center. How to do it? We go to the body, align items, center. Awesome. This is exactly what we want. There's a tiny issue here that everything is too close to the header. What if we want to put the content in the center or the middle? Again, justify content center. All right, I forgot something here. So you notice that I set I put justify content to the center, but it didn't do anything. That's because we didn't set the height to 100%. All right, so this is one way. There's another thing that we can do is the flex grow, and we set it to 1. Now the flex grow would work better, and it's because it will just grow the content inside the body instead of setting a height of 100. Because if we have a height of 100 and we have a height of 100 for the header, it will become a conflict. So let's say flex grow 1 for the body. You can see here that we still have the same height for the header, and then we have this right here. Now, what if we want to put the image next to the product name? How can we do that? Right now, we can do this by doing flexed direction row. We want a horizontal line. Nice. But there's a problem. Everything we add in the body will have this style now. It's always going to be in a row. Now, how do we fix that? Let's do some UXML work. Let's go back to the UXML and let's wrap the image and the label in its own element. For example, let's go ahead and say visual element class. Let's say product list. Okay? And we're going to say product list, and we're going to close it. Inside the product list, we're going to create a product item. So product item, and inside that product item, we are going to move the image and the label, and we're going to place them in here. All right, perfect. So now this is the product list, and then there is the product item inside of it. Now, if we copy or duplicate the product item, and we just put, for example, let's put 3 items for now, and we save them, and we go back to Unity, everything will be gone. And that's because you can't update in real time. This is why we build the UXML, then we style it, and then we build over it. Let's exit the play mode, and let's enter the play mode again. All right, let's expand the simulator, and you can see here we have a mess. And that's because we applied the style for the flex direction to be in a row. But this doesn't really matter now. Everything in here doesn't really matter. And that's because we have a product list inside the body. Let me show you. If I access the product list and I set a background color to blue, you can see here that this is the product list. And there's a lot of empty spaces around it. How do we fix that? First, let's set a width to 100%. The height is to 100% as well. So height 100%. Now we have a product list. But you can still see there is padding around it. But I like that. Why? Because the product list will not have a background. And you can see here that this is aligned perfectly, right? So we can keep the padding that we have in here, but let's say we remove the padding from the body. You can see now that the product list is too close to the edge, and look at the images. We don't want that. So let's just keep the padding like that. Now let's modify the image to have a smaller size. Let's say 50 pixels. Perfect. Now, why does the image show under or above the name when we set it in a row? That's because we created an element and we nested them inside that element called the product item. Let's access the product item by doing product item. And in here, we're going to set the flex direction to row. Perfect. But you can see here that it's still too compact. How do we fix that? First, we learned padding. Let's add a padding to the product list. So let's go ahead and say padding 5 pixels. And you can see that we move them from the sides. But do we really need that? If we remove the background, you can see that there's too much space, and we have 2 paddings now. We have in the list and we have in the container. So we probably should get rid of one of them. Let's get rid of the product list padding. Instead, let's do something better. The product list has items inside of it. We have a product item, we have a product item, we have a product item. correct? How do we fix the margin? It's called margin. Everything in between them is called margin. How to fix the margin between the list items? We can either add a margin in here and call it 5 pixel, and it will add just margin to everything. Or there's another way. If we access the product list, so product list, and there's this syntax. It's the arrow or greater than, and then a star, and then we open the brackets and we put a margin. This will add a margin to everything inside of the product list. That's another way to do it. For now, I just wanted to show you how it's done. I'm gonna ignore this. I'm gonna go and put the margin to the product item. Now the margin works the same way as the padding. We have a margin left, we have a margin right, we have a margin bottom, and so on. So for this one to work, let's say that each product will have a background, its own background. So let's go ahead and say background color, and let's find something. Oh, thank you, Copilot. This is why I like Copilot. You can see here that the product has a background now, but the background is kind of ugly. The items are not centered, and the image should not be rounded, and we have a lot of stuff to fix. But we learned everything. We learned how to set padding. We learned how to center the items. We learned how to center the text. We learned how to change images to make them squared and so on. Right? Let's start by adding a padding inside the product item. That's good. Let's center the stuff that we have inside. Align items. Center. Perfect. But look what happened if we do justify content center. We don't want that. Instead, we will remove that and we will keep it this way. What else can we do here? We can do border radius 10 pixels, for example. Perfect. We can change the image to make it maybe 8 pixels. Awesome. And we can now change the background color to something like 0.0 RGB, by the way, is something that you can use with the opacity. Amazing. Now you can see that the image is too close to the product name. We don't want that. So let's fix it. Where do we find the product name? We don't have a product name. And that's because we didn't access the product name. How do we access it? We can either do product name and then do, for example, flex grow to just make it take the full height or full width, and align it. So Unity font, Unity text align. Now in here, you don't want to put it in the middle center because the name will always start from the left. So let's say middle left. We do have the color, so we don't need to override the color. And let's add a space between the image and the name. Remember we talked about margin? That is always the space between stuff, between elements. Let's do margin left, just 5 pixels. We moved it a little bit from the left. Right? Perfect. Now, if we go up to the product list, you can see here that we have a margin. So where is the product list? Here's the product list, product item that has a margin. See? Now that margin is causing some issues. And that's because there's an empty space here, and everywhere. Let's remove the margin and see what's happening. It's ugly. We don't want that. We only want a space between the top and the bottom. We don't want the space on the left and the right. How do we do that? We can either do margin top and then 5 pixel margin bottom 5 pixels, or there's another way. With margin, you can do margin, and then margin and padding works the same, by the way. You can do 5 pixel and 0 pixel. This will apply top and bottom, left and right will be 0. So let's save, and you can see that we still have the same design with just one line of code. Right? Perfect. We learned the overflow. So let's go ahead and say overflow hidden. Awesome. Now let's see what happens if we start adding more styling to this. In the header, we don't want the background to be black, to be green, right? So what we're gonna do here is basically add a border. So let's go ahead and say border radius 10 pixel. This will be ugly. We don't want that. So let's go ahead and say border bottom width 2 pixels. Border bottom color. You can see here that we have a border, and now we can get rid of the background green. Perfect. But there's this still red background behind it, and we don't want that. So let's get rid of the container's background color. And let's also get rid of all the backgrounds that we set, the blue one. We don't want that anymore. So let's just search for blue and remove that from here. Perfect. Now, the colors are a little bit ugly, don't you think? Let's adjust them. The header can have a different color. So let's think of a color like gray. So let's go to the header again and set a background color. You can always, when you're working with black UI, you can always use the RGBA with a low opacity, and this just makes it a little bit look like more like a gray or something. But for now, I'm just gonna go with a gray color. It's 36353B. You can see here that we have a gray color for the header, and that's perfect. Now you can adjust the size of the font however you want. So let's remove the font size for the body and save. It's gone. Now we go to the product name since we have it. Let's say font size, and let's do something like 18 pixels or 16 pixels. But 18 pixels looks just fine. Now there is one more thing that we can add, I think, here. Let's just try it with the padding 3 pixels. Perfect. You can see here that the product image now has a padding of 3 pixels, and that's just because it's an icon. But if we have an image, you don't need the padding, because if I remove it, you can see here that it takes the full width and height. But if I add it, you can see here that it just adds spaces. And that's it. Now, look at this. If we change the screen, you can see, if I say iPad, for example, you can see that this is still the same height and width. And that's because we set a max width and max height. Let's change this to 850. Look at that. Change this to 600. See? Now that's how it works. All right. Now, how do we make this responsive since we are already on it? Now, this might be the most important section of the video. How to make a UI responsive? Now, to make a UI responsive, there's a lot of effort in this. Let's change a few things in here. First, we have a container. We also have a shop UI. But what if we move everything in the shop UI? What if we remove everything? So let's just say we remove all of this. Oh, one second. We remove all of this. What's going to happen? Look at that. It's ugly. What we can do here is revert the changes and move everything to the container. Remember, the container is an element that holds everything, and the shop UI also holds everything. And we learn how to set a max width, max height, and a padding. So we can put these together and make something responsive. Let's first move the background to the container. So move the background. Nothing changed, and that's because we want it that way. Let's move the position absolute to the container. Again, nothing happened because we are still working with the same stuff. Let's move the overflow to the container. It broke. I will show you why. Because we don't have a border radius. Let's move the border radius to the container. Perfect. And now let's move the align self to the container. All right. And I will show you what's happening here, why it moved. Let's remove the top from here, and let's remove the max width and max height and put them in the container. And that's it. Now, why did this move? That's because we don't have a flex direction or center items. So let's center the items. Align items, center, justify content, center. Why do I keep writing justify content center? There you go. We didn't add tops. We didn't add button. We didn't add anything. We just did a justify content to the center. And now this makes a lot of sense. We have the shop UI that takes the full width and full height of the screen. And then we have the container inside of it that has all the properties, which is position absolute. Let's remove the position absolute. We don't need it anymore. Perfect. Now we have a full UI. Now there are a few things that we can change here. For example, let's say we set an iPad view. So iPad view. Or for example, iPhone 6, which is because it's small. Now the UI is actually still perfect. It's fitting the screen perfectly. That's because we have a width on height to 100%. But look at this. What if the screen is smaller? We can now add a padding to 5 pixels. See how it shrinks the UI? Now let's go with the iPad view. So for example, iPad 4. Or let's do something bigger. Now this is too small. How do we fix that? We have a max width and max height. What if we set a minimum width and minimum height? So for example, let's go to the 13 Pro Max or the iPhone 6, right? And let's say minimum width to something like 300 pixel and minimum height to something like 400 pixels if we have smaller screens. And then if we go with something like 13 Pro Max, let's just make the width 400 pixels maybe, or even higher. Let's go with 500 pixels and double that, 700 pixels for the height. You can see that's still good. But if we now go to the iPad view, it's bigger, and that's what we want. Now we can adjust this way better. We can go ahead and say 1200 pixels, and here we can say 1000 pixels. See, now if we go back to the 13 Pro Max, it's still the exact same. And that's because we have a width and a height set to 100%, because it will take the entire screen. We have a width and a height that's minimum 300 and 400, and we have a max width and max height. So now this UI on this exact phone is trapped between these values. If you go to the 12 Pro Max or the 12, it's still the same. And now look at this. We can now add a padding, a higher padding, which will shrink the UI a little bit. We can do even 50 pixels on the padding and it will still work. And it will still maintain the same exact design on all mobiles. And why is that? That's because it's taking the full width, but it has a max and minimum width with the styling that will always make it stretch on bigger screens. So if you go with the iPhone 6, it's still... Wait, we have a problem here. That's because of the padding, because it's small, because the padding is huge. I don't want the 50 padding. I'm just going to go with the maximum padding of 10 pixels. Yeah, 10 pixels, it works fine. That was just an example. Perfect. Now, for the better part, let's exit the play mode. And let me first fix this. I like to have a capital letters over here. And let's set it the game view and hit play. Now, let me show you this. If I expand this view, look what's happening here. See how it's responsive? And that's exactly what we want. Now, let's change the max width and max height. Let's go back to our code and change the max width to something like, let's do 750 pixels with 950 pixels. Save. See what happens? It sets a max width and a max height. Now this method applies to all elements. You can literally use these methods for every single element, even the images. If you want to make the images responsive, you can do a lot of things. But the text is a little bit different. We can explain the text, but since you have a general idea on how it works, I will give you a quick example on how you can make the text responsive. If we go to the documentation and we go to the responsive UI, we find the creating responsive text. So here's the USML that we have. We have a description and we have a label inside of it. We set the description to height and width to maximum, and then we flex wrap it with the white space. let's see how this works. So for example, in our code, we have a product item, and the product item has a product name. So we scroll down, and we can tell here that we have a product item and a product name. So let's fix this by moving the flex scroll to here. And no, that's ugly. That's because we don't have a, let me just do this and that. That's because we don't have a max width and max height. But what if we set a max width and max height here? Let's just try. So max height, something like 50 pixels maybe. That's too low. 60 pixels. And then minimum height 60 pixels. Now, this works. But again, I don't need this method right now. Instead, what I want to do is just make the text responsive. First things first, white space, set to normal, and then flex wrap, set to wrap. Let's see a few things here. So background color, red. There you go. Now you can see that because we have a flex grow 1, the width is always full. But if we remove the flex grow, it will always set the width of this element to the text itself. But we don't want that. And that's because we want to make the white space responsive. Because if we have a flex grow like this, and we write stuff in here, you can see that it's going to change with, one sec, it's going to change with this, yeah, perfect. Now, if we have like a long text here, we'll just create a new line and put it in under the, under one another, which is perfect. So let's just get rid of the background color and let's look at our game. And there you go. You have a UI. That's perfect. That's exactly what we've been looking for. In the next video, we are going to explain about Lua integration, bindings, and how you can make things actually work. How you can put a button here that says close and you click on it and just close the UI. How you can import the image, how you can make these. Actually, let's show you right now about the hovering. So let's find, okay, so there is our USS and we have a bunch of product items. Let's go ahead and say product item hover, and let's just change the scale to 0.9. Now look what happened when I hover over the items. You can see now we added a hover effect. That's all for today's video. I hope you guys learned something new. This was a long video, but we will have another episode explaining the other stuff just to not keep you, bored. Go ahead, search the asset catalog, because if you see here, we have a bunch of UIs that you can reverse engineer and you can learn from. Let me just bring this. We have an external leaderboard, daily rewards. We have the Highrise Life Toolkit. All of them has a lot of UI examples that you can use from. Now that you learned the basics and how to create a UI, I will see you in the next video. I hope you guys stay safe and take care.